Okay, welcome to Lunar Alchemy, everybody. My name is John, and joining me today from Sweden, Bella, as always, from a new part of the world. Bella, thank you so much for joining me today from halfway around the world. How's it feel on the other side?
It feels cold and dark for sure.
Well, I can kind of sympathize with that feeling because of the current lunar cycle that's happening right now. It's giving us a big burst of that feeling that spring is coming. So to be somewhere where it's still very dark and chilly, I can imagine has a little bit of a impact on the system. Anyways, today, what we're going to be talking about is Gene Key 63 and the archetype of the detective. Since our new focus with Lunar Alchemy is on archetypes and the elements, we're going to be discussing the archetype of the detective, Gene Key 63, and this pathway of the shadow of doubt to the city of truth and the way of inquiry. So, let's see, Bella, I'm gonna make you a co-host. So to get started off, when I think of a detective, Bella, the first thing that comes to mind for me is those old Humphrey Bogart movies where he plays a detective. And it's some form of a whodunit, like he's trying to discover who's responsible for the crime or something of that nature. And somehow I never associate that particular character with a process of arriving at this absolute truth of the city of this particular gene key. So I'm wondering if our American pop culture detective gumshoe kind of cultural focus is somehow skewed away from what is being pointed at with this particular gene key. And I'm curious to hear your perspective about it, because this idea of a detective being this sort of like sleuthy, undercover, sort of secretive, kind of skirting the law, but getting it done anyways. I'm curious if that perspective also, you also share that, or if there's a different look at this.
I don't think I would name this archetype the detective if I was going to name it now. And also the harmonic gate, which is the fourth gate, which is the philosopher. I would not name them the philosopher and the detective. And partly this is because we started in gate 3 when we were reconsidering all the archetypes last year, and there was a gap. So all the archetypes we are now, they were coming through in 2020, and then we didn't review them. And you're going to see on the website now as well that the descriptions are really short all the way until April. I think there was a good intent with it when we said a detective, because you can see that it's a truth seeker, and somehow we could say that a detective in the higher frequency would be a truth seeker. But I agree that there's almost like too many connotations, too many things that makes us think about the detective in the way that we have been used to see detective in the movies and in books and things like that. So that's my answer.
Well, you know, I also kind of like the title for this archetype because of the perspective that that even with all of the connotations, that detective, when Humphrey Bogart is taking on a job, his motivation has nothing to do with the truth being one way or the other. He's completely unattached to the outcome. He only wants to solve the puzzle. And I like that, because that's also in the spirit of inquiry, where if you become attached to the outcome of your search or your questing or your seeking or asking, usually you end up in some kind of cycle in the shadow frequencies. You know, you're either doubting yourself or you're suspicious of other people. And that detective archetype, you know, that idea, there's a certain amount of, usually those stories kind of, they evolve and they let you see only so much of what's happening, where the detective knows something that you haven't seen yet, right? And then later on, they sort of reveal why the detective was able to solve it. So we're like, oh, you know, it's kind of this sort of reveal, which is always fun. But this function of doubt leading ever forward and ever deeper into an exploration of reality. It feels like a really powerful combination of these three forms of this energy. You know, sometimes it feels like there's a really clear delineation between the shadow and the gift frequencies of some gene keys, but here it's almost like the shadow is like the primary thing, and if you really put your faith in it, it'll take you all the way to the edge. So Bella, I'm wondering, we've never really had much of a discussion about this before, but this gene key Richard Rudd describes as being directly related to yoga. And I know that you've either do or have practiced yoga a great deal in the past, and as have I. And I'm curious about how you see this gene key, and to whatever extent it relates, this archetype as relating to the path and the process of yoga, or the science of yoga as it's often described.
Yeah, I love the two last gene keys, and they connect to the two first gene keys, 1 and 2, and 63 and 64. They are those fire letters, or the 4 pillars of the whole I Ching. And we have the yin and the yang, and the 1 and the 2, the prime yin and yang. But here we're going to see perfect geometries where we have yang and yin sandwiched, like and then they are the opposite. And it's also the opposite in the sense that it's going to be fire and water in the 63 and the 64 in the trigrams. So there is a geometry here that's really interesting. And whether we come from the masculine and we serve the feminine, or we come from the feminine and then we receive the masculine, it's still going to lead us to truth and illumination. So it's for me, what the 63 is showing us is that masculine way of concentration is the way we start, but then it's surrendering with the feminine, and it's coming to truth, it's coming to illumination at the end. So what I think when we speak about the path of yoga or the path of tantra, it's really where we start, but where we end up, it's still the truth, it's still the illumination of something more. So it actually doesn't really matter. And for me, I also think that yoga is not that black and white, because there are many yogic paths that are also more influenced already of the tantric path. Like it always goes toward that anyway. So for me, my yogic practice is tantric as well, is what I feel. I cannot do without it. But yeah, I do see more of that concentration, and what we can see in the detective too. The detective says, I'm going to solve this. I'm going to focus and solve this until I know what happened. Like I say, I don't have a judgment about what happened, but I'll go there, I look at the details, and I'll find out. And that's the same thing. Like when you start and you are in your asanas and you're feeling your body opening, and you have that intent, like, and often with yoga, you have some kind of teacher, some kind of role model, and you can feel when your body opens, and that gives you that same, I feel, motivation as a detective has to come closer to truth, closer to openness, closer to light, illumination. So
yeah, I feel like this, another reason why I appreciate this particular archetype is I feel like in general society, this role has kind of blossomed amongst a large number of people. One of the sayings that comes up on social media, or at least was coming up all the time for a while, particularly during the Trump presidency, was this refrain of "do your research," as if searching on the internet would lead you to the truth, as long as you looked in the right places, right? And one of the things that I love about this gene key is that anytime you land in a place and you've decided, you latch on to a piece of information or a perspective or an idea or a location or something where you've decided that this is the truth and everything else isn't right, that's when you've lost the path towards this tantric resolution, I guess you might want to describe it as. We could describe it as, I guess. And so in the path of yoga, it's like we're going to have moments where our awareness shifts. And people all over the world are having this all the time. I mean, there are groups that I'm a member in on Facebook and social media where, it's talking about ascension, and people post all this stuff about aliens and whatnot. And another one of the refrains is "when I awakened," followed by blah, 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 blah. And I understand what's being communicated. I don't necessarily think that anybody that uses that particular phrase, it believes that their journey is over, and now now that they've seen the light, there's nowhere else to grow to. But our language itself kind of like puts you in a corner, and unless we hold on to that like dedication to doubting not only the conditioning that we're aware of, but also the perceptions that we're having that are leading us out of that conditioning into a new perception. Unless we hold on to that doubt, we're going to lose the path. So like this relentless seeking of the absolute truth, this sort of masculine focus, when I think about it, it seems so hyper intensive. And with the changes that have been happening in the world, which for me, I feel like there's been this growing awareness of feminine energy and how we can adapt more of our experiences to taking on the quality of the feminine rather than throwing it aside for masculine processes. I'm sort of wondering, like, we've had some discussions recently about this masculine feminine balance that is a new possibility in the world. And can this yogic path and this tantra path, like, how do we navigate these experiences? Like, do we bring doubt into these more feminine experiences that are more relatable to tantric practices of sort of union? Or do we separate them? You were kind of mentioning, in your yogic experience is kind of tantric in nature, and I I also kind of have a hard time like separating yoga and tantra from each other, because it kind of seem like the same thing. Like, the point of yoga is never about trying to remain on a masculine line. It's just a pathway that works. So what is going to change about our relationship with doubt and how it functions in this sort of new exploration of a new possibility that we may be coming up to in the world? I don't know if you have thoughts about that, Bella.
Yeah, when I hear you, I think about human capacity, and I can see even some of the teachers that we are using in our conversation, Ra, who came up with human design, and Richard, who came up with gene keys, and how they are both kind of become, at least Richard from the beginning was part of human design. And of course he wanted it to be part of human design. And Ra used to say the gene keys and speak about it as the UK franchise of human design. So they were one, but then the way that they went separate ways, and the way that then Ra set up everything up, that you can't synthesize the system with anything else. And then Richard saying, start with one system, just one system. It doesn't even have to be the gene keys, but do one system and go deep, And another example, just in my life with my parents, they told that was in the 80s, and they told my dad, they were living in Sweden, speak Swedish first, and then she speaks Swedish, but then you can introduce Spanish, because that way it's safer. So there is this belief that it might be safer to go down one path, whether it's feminine. Seems like that would be safer. However, my example of how I did it, I started with both, and the synthesis of them. My internet. Can you still hear me? I think my internet.
Yeah, you're just kind of a little chopping in and out there. But I think we get the gist. You're talking about how even in your own life you were learning Spanish and Swedish, and there was this idea of learning them separately because it's safer that way, less confusion, for instance, from the 64.
Now am I back?
Yeah, you're back.
I didn't hear anything for a while. Okay, so I'm just going to continue. I don't know what happened in the meantime, but what I did feel is like I was a synthesizer. I learned Spanish and Swedish, and I explained when I was 18 months what the children's television program was about. So it didn't make me speak later on. And the fact that with Unlock Your Design, we're synthesizing gene keys in human design, there's a lot of value in that for people. And this takes me back to the human capacity, because I believe that we more and more, we have this capacity for sacred union, where we are taking in the feminine, the masculine, or Swedish and Spanish, or human design and gene keys. So are our parents, or we as parents, going to trust our children to be synthesizers and to be able to hold the whole scope of that union? I would, as a parent, and I do with the people that choose to be in my communities. I think it's a matter of perspective, but I think it's a pity that sometimes we are not allowing, people to go down several paths at the same time. I think that confusion doesn't come from the outside of learning two languages or two systems. I think confusion exists on the inside. Doubt exists on the inside, and then it's just projected out, and that's reflected back to us.
Yeah. So, when I was thinking about the people that this gene key brings to mind, the first person I thought of was Einstein. And particularly because of this relationship between the 63 and the 64, where there's inquiry and imagination happening. And Einstein had such a reverence for imagination, and so much of his process in scientific discovery was based less on some working out the answers. And it was more about, could he imagine a bigger question? And he himself even suggested that the answers that he received, he just received them. They just like popped into his head, And to me, it seems like the process of inquiry, while it may be an extraordinarily masculine process, it only functions properly within the presence of the feminine. If you can ask the questions, but you don't have the space to receive any possibilities for solutions or answers, or however you want to look at it, new perspectives, then what's the point of asking the question? What is the point of going through the process of trying to work out the answer to whatever it is you're wondering? Like, why even go through those steps if you're never going to get to a point of feminine receiving? It's just like, it's pointless. It's like building a building in the middle of a city and then not allowing anybody to occupy it. Like, if you're not going to let anybody get in there and use the space, why are you building it? So it feels like, when you're talking about what is Unlock Your Design about, and synthesizing human design and gene keys, and here we are working with Lunar Alchemy, which is like really even another synthesis of a variety of different pathways. I mean, looking at the cycles of the moon and the positioning of the sun, where this kind of arose from, one of the big resonances that I found was in the work of Rudolf Steiner, although there's a lot of yogic basis for looking at lunar cycles as well. We just had a new moon like a couple days ago, and we're at a point in our year where the inward focus of winter, where everything recedes, everything sort of like goes into hibernation and gets drawn deeper and deeper and deeper within itself, has suddenly transformed into an upward expansiveness, where plants can now start to pop up out of the ground, and these forces of nature are moving upwards now and outwards and expanding. And when we look at nature, it's like there's never such a thing in nature as endless expansion. Whenever something propagates, at some point, it either gets put in check by some other species, like a bunch of predators show up to to prevent this overpopulation of rodents or whatever it is, or the expansion kind of like turns in on itself because it's gotten to the edge of as far as it can go on its own path, and now it has to create space. And that really, to me, it's like the I Ching is called after completion. And it's like you get a strong yang line with a weak line above it, followed by another strong, and then a weak, and then a strong, and then a weak line. And it's like everything is perfect. But we all know that nothing is going to stop changing. So as soon as one line changes, that like sort of perfect balance that we just reached is totally back into imbalance, and which moves evolution forward. I love this, Bella, cooking the alchemical cauldron of wisdom. Do you have any perspective about this? It's water over fire. So water in a cauldron over a fire. Do you have any perspective about this image, or this particular page that you wanted to share and talk about? Oh, you're quiet. There you go.
It does feel natural to me if we are thinking about humanity and how we nurture. If we have the fire and then we have the soup or the water or the bowl, and we are cooking, we are preparing. So for me, this feels in a way like kind of that completion of things. And then when we do it the other way around in the 64, I mean, then it starts to become art for me. It becomes a different process. But here, and even like saying the masculine power turns to serve the feminine love, it just, this one is the logical circuitry, and it does make a lot of sense. The 63 for me makes a lot of sense. And even for me, the word inquiry, I love it. Water and fire for me are very alive element, communicating passion. Like water and fire is Shakti. When they come together, it's not calm, it's passion. For me, the word inquiry really speaks to that witnessing of what's there. And sometimes I do feel that the word contemplation is more mental, or the word contemplation is less energy in it. Inquiry has a curiosity in it, has an aliveness in it. So even that, as the gift frequency for this hexagram, feels so beautiful, and that there is a presence, that kind of masculine presence as well in the inquiry that comes back and serves and witnesses.
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting contemplations of this particular gene key is what is the result of this combination of elements, and what does that mean about what's happening inside of us as a result of this particular aspect of humanity. One of the things that is starting to grow on me or dawn on me or something as we're talking about these archetypes, Bella, is that the archetypes are universal, and we all have some relationship to them. And they have so much to do with the embodiment of these gene key frequencies. It's kind of giving me a different look at how we relate to each gene key. Like, it's not even that, my life's work is the 29, which is water over water. And this particular gene key is so related to my life's work and evolution, because water over water leads to fire over fire. Those are the programming partners. And here, 63 is the combination of the two, water over fire. So what happens when those two elements really get together? And, one of the things that is spoken about in this particular one is that, there's a very delicate balance that gets met. If the fire is blazing too hot, and the water starts boiling over, it'll put the fire out. Likewise, if the fire is too hot, and eventually the water will boil away into the air. But while these two are in relationship, they can create steam, which is a movement and is really the energy source responsible for the majority of our modern day world. You know, steam energy pretty much put industry into a plausible mode for development of human civilization. And you know, harnessing that energy and being able to use it, it's like, for me, the element of an archetypal kind of relationship, when I mention, okay, so who's the ultimate detective? Well, I said Einstein, but then I think maybe Nikola Tesla, because Tesla was all about application, and he was all about harnessing the truth that he had access to and putting it into something that could be practically used. Even though most of his inventions, you know, got sort of squashed in one way or another, you know, it just makes me think that, like, that this particular gene key, there's a huge potential for application. And you know, Bella, when we come together in relationship and there's a lot of masculine energy and there's a lot of feminine energy and there's this crackling energy of the two together and everything starts moving and everything is like vibrant and alive, is there some way that we can shift our relating that allows that relationship to harness that energy in a more positive way or in a more practical way? Because, you know, in so many relationships, there's this feeling of like, when you're drawn together so intensely, there's an equal rebounding movement that happens where it's like, oh, well, we're either totally together or we're like arguing and raging at each other and blowing everything up.
Mm-hmm.
How can we kind of capture the energy of that coming together and use it in a practical way?
Yeah, I feel it goes back to what we said before. That clash is on the inside because we haven't found the union on the inside. So then it's going to be reflected on the outside. And it's kind of maybe a boring answer, but we need to accept that Shakti inside of us and understand how to channel it. And I do believe that with yoga, you have a very safe vessel. I do yoga, I can do athletic yoga for an hour, 75 minutes, and it's really tough. And I have even, you know, my heart rate goes up and I have to really breathe in order to be able to do it. And then there is Shavasana and we lay down at the end and my body is basically, you know, completely in like Kundalini bliss. And I know that it's safe because my vessel has done all the concentration work. So there is nothing stuck when that energy moves. So I know that when we tend to the path of concentration, but also to the tantric path, then we can embody both of them and it's safe. So for me, synthesis is safe just because we have focused on both. It's going to be safe, or it's going to function to have a conversation with me in Swedish and in Spanish because I tend to both languages. And that's where I feel like we come back to. And the last thing I want to say as well has to do with detective, that I feel like finding a name for the detective that could show us that logic can only take us so far. Because at the end of the day, we know that each path has to surrender to the other. So the detective might make us think that just that detective work, the concentration to the details to the end, it's enough. But if we could find an archetype name for the 63 that tells us that logic can only take us that far, that would be the perfect name. So somehow that could be an inquiry for all of us to come closer to the truth of the archetype name of the 63.
Beautiful. Yeah. So for those of you that are following on Facebook, if you have some ideas about that, would love to hear what your thoughts are about the detective, and how can we personally engage this limitation of that logic places on our understanding of reality. And also, I'm just posting right now how to explore lunar alchemy deeper, in a deeper way, to receive the quantum elemental transmissions that we're offering each week. You can click on the link in the comments that I'm posting right now. And as we're looking at the I Ching, the fire, the water over the fire, it produces steam, which is carried by air. And one of the ways that we can get lost in this particular shadow is when we place ourselves in this element of the air, into our thoughts, into our concentration. And we begin to float away from the reality that's present oftentimes. That's not part of the nature of air, but it's just something that we do in relationship to it. And this is sort of like what happened for so many people over the prior maybe 4 or 5 years, and people that are beginning to look at reality from a different perspective and discovering things about reality that were previously hidden, is that when we get too far committed to the logic that we are adopting as our method for exploration, when we hold that logic as the dearest aspect of our inquiry, then we get carried away into these sort of far off ideas that may not fully reflect the reality that's going on around us. And from Bella's, your suggestion about your practice in yoga, that embodiment aspect of making your body a very stable place to explore that inquiry seems very, very important. So here we are on Facebook having a discussion. It's very airy up here, right? We're talking about ideas about archetypes and how do we relate with them, and masculine energy and feminine energy. And it really strikes me that when we start working these things into our body is when it really lands into an evolutionary process, rather than something that's floating up in the air for us to be distracted from the reality that we're a part of. So we're going to be today doing an elemental transmission for air, and how we can change our relationship to the potential for accessing the truth that lives inside us, rather than relying on this sort of artificial construct of logic, becoming an open vessel to receive and express the truth that is at all times occurring. So for those of you on Facebook, thanks for joining us for our discussion today. We will look forward to seeing you in a future discussion, and I hope that the remainder of this transit for you, you can really engage in that sort of wonder that can come along with this gift of inquiry. And if you come up with a nuance to the detective archetype that you would love to share, please share it on the Unlock Your Design page. We'd love to hear from you about your experience with that. So we'll see you next time.